My father's last words to me were, "You'll never amount to anything, Marcus." 3 days later, I was sitting in a lawyer's office, staring at a will that made me the sole heir to his $20 million empire. But there was a catch that would change everything I thought I knew about my life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The funeral home smelled like lilies and regret. I stood at the back of the room, watching strangers in expensive suits pay their respects to Theodore Blackwood, the man who'd spent 32 years making sure I knew I was his greatest disappointment. The irony wasn't lost on me that more people showed up to mourn him than had ever bothered to acknowledge my existence. "Marcus?" A woman in a navy blazer approached me. "Name's Sarah Mitchell from Hartwell and Associates, your father's attorney. We speak privately?" I followed her to a small office adjacent to the main viewing room. She pulled out a manila folder, her expression unreadable. "I'm sorry for your loss," she began, though we both knew it was a formality. "Your father left specific instructions about his estate. The reading is scheduled for tomorrow at 2 o'clock. I almost laughed. "Let me guess. He left everything to charity, just to make sure I got nothing one last time?" Sarah's eyebrows raised slightly. "Actually, Mr. Blackwood, you might want to sit down for this." The next afternoon, I found myself in a conference room with mahogany walls and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Chicago, beside Sarah and her associate. There were only 2 other people present. My father's longtime business partner, Richard Carver, and his secretary of 15 years, Helen Morrison. Both looked as confused as I felt about why I was there. Sarah opened the leather-bound document and cleared her throat. "The last will and testament of Theodore James Blackwood." She glanced at me before continuing. "To my son, Marcus Daniel Blackwood, I leave my entire estate, including all assets, properties, business interests, valued at approximately $22 million. The silence in the room was deafening. Richard's face went pale and Helen's mouth fell open. I felt like I'd been struck by lightning. "There has to be a mistake," Richard stammered. "Ted always said there's no mistake," Sarah interrupted. "However, there are conditions." Of course there were. My father couldn't just give me something without strings attached, even from beyond the grave. The inheritance comes with a sealed letter that can only be opened by Marcus, and a rather unusual stipulation. She pulled out a thick envelope and a smaller sealed document. "Mr. Blackwood must live in his father's house for exactly 1 year. During this time, he cannot sell, transfer, or dispose of any inherited assets. If he fails to complete this requirement, the entire estate will be donated to the Chicago Children's Hospital." I stared at the envelope in her hands. My father's house. The place where I'd spent 18 years being reminded daily that I wasn't good enough, smart enough, or worthy enough to carry the Blackwood name. The thought of returning there made my stomach turn. "What kind of sick joke is this?" I muttered. "There's more," Sarah continued. "Your father also left video messages to be played at specific intervals during your year of residence. The first one is to be viewed tonight, after you've moved in." Richard leaned forward, his voice tight with anger. "This is insane. I built that company with Ted. We were partners for 25 years. Marcus doesn't know the first thing about running a business. He wasn't wrong. I'd spent the last decade bouncing between dead-end jobs, living in a studio apartment that barely qualified as livable. My father had made sure I knew I was unwelcome in the family business, and I'd eventually stop trying to prove him wrong. Nevertheless, Sarah said firmly, "These are your father's wishes, and they're legally binding." I took the envelope with shaking hands. It was heavier than I had expected, sealed with my father's distinctive wax stamp, a blackbird in flight. The same symbol. That had been on his business cards, his stationery, everything that mattered to him. Everything except me. "I need some time to think about this," I said. "Of course. But I should mention that the 1-year period begins immediately upon your acceptance. If you choose to accept the inheritance, you have 48 hours to move into the house." As I walked out of that office, my mind was reeling. $22 million. The house on Maple Ridge where I'd grown up, the company that had always been off limits to me, It felt like winning the lottery and being handed a prison sentence at the same time. I drove through the old neighborhood in my beat-up Honda Civic, feeling like an imposter among the manicured lawns and luxury cars. The house looked exactly as I remembered, a sprawling colonial with white pillars and black shutters, surrounded by perfectly trimmed hedges. The same house where my father had told me I was worthless more times than I could count. The key was still hidden under the fake rock by the front door. Some things never change. I let myself in, and the familiar smell of leather and aftershave hit me like a physical blow. Everything was exactly as he'd left it. His reading chair by the fireplace, his collection of first edition books, the portrait of my mother who died when I was 12, the last person who'd ever believed in me. I found the video equipment Sarah had mentioned set up in his study. A tablet with a note, "Play when ready, TB." Even in death, he was giving me orders. The screen flickered to life, and there he was. Theodore Blackwood, looking every inch the successful businessman in his tailored suit and silver hair. Something was different about his expression. For the first time in my life, he didn't look angry or disappointed when he looked at me. "Marcus," his recorded voice began, "if you're watching this, you've decided to accept my terms. I imagine you're wondering why I'm putting you through this. The answer isn't what you think." I leaned forward, my heart pounding. "You probably believe I hate you, that I think you're a failure, that I'm disappointed in who you've become." Paused, and for a moment I saw something I'd never seen before: vulnerability. "The truth is far more complicated than that," the video continued, but I could barely process what I was hearing. This wasn't the man who'd spent my entire childhood telling me I'd never measure up. This was someone else entirely. "There are things about your mother's death that you don't know. Things about our family that I've kept hidden. The real reason I pushed you away had nothing to do with disappointment, and everything to do with keeping you safe." Safe. From what? Check the locked drawer in my desk. The combination is your mother's birthday. What you find there will explain everything, including why I needed you to stay away from the business until now. The video ended, leaving me staring at a black screen. My hands were trembling as I turned to the massive oak desk that had always been off limits to me as a child. The locked drawer I'd always wondered about was on the bottom right. My mother's birthday, 0847. The drawer opened with a soft click, revealing a collection of folders, photographs, and documents. The top was a newspaper clipping from 33 years ago with the headline, "Local businessman's wife dies in mysterious accident." Mysterious accident? I'd always been told my mother died in a car crash. But as I read the article, details emerged that I'd never heard before. The investigation had been closed abruptly. There had been questions about the brake lines being cut. My father had received anonymous threats in the weeks leading up to her death. Underneath the clipping was a manila folder labeled "Carver Investigation" in my father's handwriting. Inside were bank records, legal documents, and what appeared to be evidence of embezzlement going back decades. Richard Carver, my father's trusted business partner, had been stealing from the company for years. But the most shocking discovery was a series of photographs showing Richard meeting with known criminals, including Vincent Torino, a man whose name I recognized from news reports about organized crime in Chicago. The dates on the photos went back to just before my mother's death. A handwritten note in my father's script was paperclipped to the photos. Richard discovered that Elizabeth knew about the embezzlement. She was going to report him. He had her killed and made it look like an accident. I've been gathering evidence ever since, but I needed to keep Marcus away from the business and from me until I could prove it. If something happens to me, this is everything needed to put him away. I sank into my father's chair, my entire worldview crumbling. Every harsh word, every rejection, every time he'd called me useless, it had all been an act. He'd been protecting me from a man who'd already killed once to protect his secrets. The weight of 32 years of misunderstanding crashed down on me. My father hadn't hated me. He'd loved me enough to sacrifice our relationship to keep me alive. And now, apparently, he thought it was safe enough to bring me back into the fold. But was it? Richard had been at the will reading. He'd seen my father leave everything to me. If he was really a killer, what would he do now that I was a threat to everything he'd built? My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Congratulations. On your inheritance, we should talk. R.C. Richard Carver, the man who'd potentially killed my mother and spent decades stealing from my father, now he wanted to talk. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I stared at the text message until my eyes burned. Richard Carver wanted to talk. That same man who, according to my father's evidence, had orchestrated my mother's murder and stolen millions from the company over the years. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the anger that had been building since I discovered the truth about my childhood. I typed back, tomorrow, 10 a.m., Starbucks on Michigan Avenue. His response came immediately, looking forward to it. The casual tone made my skin crawl. This man had destroyed my family, and he was treating it like a business meeting. Sleep didn't come that night. I wandered through the house, seeing everything with new eyes. The portrait of my mother in the living room seemed to watch me as I passed. She looked so young, so alive. According to the police report I'd found in my father's files, she'd been just 29 when she died, the same age I was now, in the kitchen. I found something I'd never noticed before, a small notebook wedged behind the coffee maker. My mother's handwriting filled the pages. It was a journal, and the final entry was dated 3 days before her death. Ted's been acting strange lately. He insists I don't go to the office anymore and says it's not safe. When I asked him what he meant, he just held me tight and said he was handling it. I found some financial documents in his briefcase that don't make sense. Numbers that don't add up. I think Richard might be stealing from the company, but I need to be sure before I say anything. If I'm right, this could destroy everything Ted has worked for. My hands shook as I read her words. She'd figured it out. She'd known Richard was embezzling, and she'd died for it. But my father had blamed himself all these years, thinking he hadn't protected her well enough. The next morning, I arrived at the Starbucks early and chose a table in the back corner where I could see the entrance. Richard walked in at exactly 10 a.m., looking like the successful businessman he'd always pretended to be. Designer suit, Italian leather shoes, silver hair, perfectly styled. If I hadn't seen the evidence, I would never have suspected him of being capable of murder. "Marcus," he said, sliding into the seat across from me, "you look well. This inheritance business must be quite a shock. Cut the act, Richard. I know what you did." His smile didn't waver, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "I'm afraid I don't know what you mean." I pulled out one of the photographs from my father's files and placed it on the table. It showed Richard shaking hands with Vincent Torino outside a warehouse on the south side of Chicago. The date stamp read 3 weeks before my mother's death. Richard's composure cracked for just a moment. "Where did you get this?" My father was more thorough than you gave him credit for. He knew about the embezzlement. He knew about your connection to the Torino family, and he knew you killed my mother. Your father was a paranoid old man who saw conspiracies everywhere, Richard said, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. Elizabeth's death was an accident, a tragic accident. Brake lines don't cut themselves, Richard. He leaned back in his chair, studying me with calculating eyes. You're playing a dangerous game, Marcus. Your father understood that. That's why he kept you away from all of this. That's why he pushed you out of his life. He was protecting you. And now he's dead. And you're not nearly as smart as he was. Richard's mask was completely off now. Do you really think you can just waltz into that company and take over? You don't understand how things work in the real world. You don't understand the delicate balance your father maintained. Enlighten me. Richard looked around the coffee shop, then leaned forward. Your father's company wasn't just a legitimate business, Marcus. It was a front, a way to launder money for certain interests. Your father knew this, and he allowed it to continue because he understood the alternative. My blood ran cold. You're lying, am I? Check the books more carefully. Look at the cash transactions, the overseas accounts. Your father wasn't the saint you think he was. He was complicit in everything. Even if that's true, it doesn't justify murdering my mother. Your mother was going to destroy everything, Richard said, his voice hardening. She was going to go To the FBI with her suspicions, do you know what would have happened to your father? To you, the people I work with don't forgive, and they don't forget. I felt sick, so you had her killed. I saved your father's life. I saved your life. Elizabeth was collateral damage in a much bigger game. He pulled out his phone and showed me a photo.
Oh.
It was recent, taken from across the street. A picture of me leaving the house that morning. The same people who wanted her dead are still around, Marcus. Now they're watching you. The coffee shop suddenly felt too small, too exposed. I looked around, wondering if anyone else was listening to our conversation. What do you want, Richard? I want to make a deal. You sign over your shares in the company to me, and I'll make sure you stay safe. You can keep the house, keep most of the inheritance, but the business operations need to stay under my control. And if I refuse, his smile was reptilian, then you'll end up like your mother, except this time there won't be any investigation. These people have gotten much better at making problems disappear. I stood up, my legs unsteady. I need time. To think, of course, but don't take too long. My associates are not known for their patience. As I walked out of the coffee shop, I could feel his eyes on my back. Every person on the street seemed like a potential threat. Every car that passed could be following me. I'd inherited more than just money and property. I'd inherited a war that had been going on for over 30 years. Back at the house, I found another video message waiting for me. This one was labeled Day 2 and had been programmed to unlock automatically. My father's face appeared on the screen, and this time he looked tired, older. Marcus, if you're watching this, you've probably met with Richard by now. He's likely tried to convince you that I was involved in his illegal activities. Let me be clear, I was not. But I did know about them, and I spent years gathering evidence while pretending to be oblivious. The video continued. The legitimate parts of our business are worth about $12 million. The other $10 million that Richard has been using for money laundering operations is in separate accounts that he controls. My lawyers have been working for years to untangle the legitimate assets from the illegal ones. It's why this inheritance has so many conditions. I paused the video, my mind racing. If my father had been building a case against Richard for years, why hadn't he gone to the police? I know you're wondering why I didn't just turn him in, my father continued, as if reading my thoughts. The answer is simple. I tried. 3 years ago, I contacted FBI agent Patricia Wells. She was investigating the Torino family's financial operations. 2 weeks later, she was found dead in her apartment. Apparent suicide. The room felt like it was spinning. How deep did this conspiracy go? I realized then that Richard had connections inside law enforcement, people who would protect him and eliminate threats. So I changed tactics. Instead of trying to expose him through official channels, I decided to build an airtight case that could be presented all at once. With too much evidence to ignore, the safety deposit box coordinates led me to a small bank in Evanston, 30 minutes north of Chicago. I'd spent the previous night studying every document in my father's safe, memorizing names, dates, and connections. The web of corruption was more extensive than I'd imagined. But I'd also found something that gave me hope, a name that wasn't on any of the compromised lists. Detective Angela Rodriguez had been investigating financial crimes for the Illinois State Police for 8 years. According to my father's notes, she'd been asking questions about suspicious transactions involving several Chicago businesses, including ours. More importantly, she'd been doing it independently, without federal oversight. That made her either very brave or very stupid. I was hoping for bravery. The safety deposit box contained 3 items: an encrypted hard drive, a handwritten letter, and a single key. The letter was addressed to me, but the handwriting was different from my father's usual script. Shakier, more urgent. Marcus, if you're reading this, I'm probably dead. This hard drive contains recorded conversations between Richard and Vincent. Torino, going back 5 years. The key opens a storage unit in Oak Park, Unit 247. Inside, you'll find the original brake line from your mother's car.
Oh.
Never processed by the police. DNA evidence that will prove Richard's involvement. I've been saving it for 32 years, waiting for the right moment. That moment is now, but be careful who you trust. Detective Rodriguez is clean, but her partner, Detective Mills, is on Richard's payroll. Use this information wisely. Your mother would be proud of who you've become. Dad, my hands were shaking as I folded the letter. My father had been planning this for decades, slowly building a case that would finally bring justice for my mother. But the weight of that responsibility was crushing. I drove to Oak Park, checking my mirrors every few minutes. Richard's threats weren't idle. I'd noticed the same black sedan following me since I'd left the bank. The storage facility was in an industrial area, surrounded by warehouses and empty lots, perfect for an ambush. The storage unit was small, but packed with evidence. Boxes of financial records, photographs, and in the back corner, a clear plastic container with a twisted piece of metal inside. The brake line from my mother's car. Even after all these years, I could see where it had been cleanly cut, but I wasn't alone. As I reached for the container, I heard footsteps behind me. I was wondering when you'd show up here. I spun around to find Detective Rodriguez standing in the doorway, her hand resting on her holster. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe mid-30s, with sharp eyes and an expression that revealed nothing. "Detective Rodriguez?" I asked, my voice barely steady. "Your father contacted me 6 months ago. Said he had evidence of corruption that went all the way to the FBI. I thought he was just another paranoid businessman until he started sending me proof." She stepped into the unit, looking around at the boxes. "Looks like he was telling the truth. How did you know I'd be here?" "I've been watching you since the beginning, Richards. People have been watching you too, but they're not as subtle as they think they are." She pulled out her phone and showed me a photo of the black sedan. "That's Detective Mills and his partner. They've been following you on Richard's orders. The betrayal cut deep. Even the police couldn't be trusted." "What do you want from me?" I asked. "I want to finish what your father started. But I need your help. This evidence is useless without someone willing to testify about what they know. Someone standing to bring a civil case while we build the criminal one. And if I refuse, then Richard wins. Your mother's death goes unpunished. And eventually, you'll end up dead too." She was right, but the fear was paralyzing. I wasn't a hero. I was just a guy who'd inherited a nightmare. "There's something else," Rodriguez continued. "Your father wasn't the only one building a case. Agent Patricia Wells, the FBI agent who died 3 years ago, she didn't commit suicide. She was murdered. But before she died, she passed her files to someone outside the FBI. Someone Richard doesn't know about." "Who?" "U.S. Attorney Sarah Chen. She's been quietly investigating federal corruption for the past 2 years. She's clean, and she's been waiting for the right moment to move. Your father's evidence might be that moment." The car door slammed outside. Rodriguez immediately drew her weapon, motioning for me to get behind the boxes. "Stay down," she whispered. Through the gap in the door, I could see Detective Mills and another man approaching. "They were armed, and they didn't look like they were here to arrest anyone, Rodriguez," Mills called out. "We know you're in there. Come out and we can talk about this." "No talking," Rodriguez whispered to me. "When I tell you to run, head for the back of the facility. There's a hole in the fence behind Unit 300. Go straight to the federal building downtown. Ask for Sarah Chen. Tell her code Phoenix." "What about you?" "I'll be fine. This is what I signed up for." Mills and his partner were getting closer. I could hear them coordinating, one going left, the other right. They had us surrounded. "Now," Rodriguez whispered. I grabbed the brake line. "Evidence," and ran. Behind me, I heard shouting, then gunshots. My heart was pounding as I sprinted between the storage units. Looking for the hole in the fence Rodriguez had mentioned, more gunshots. I couldn't tell if Rodriguez was alive or dead, but I couldn't help her by getting caught. I found the gap in the fence and squeezed through, cutting my jacket on the twisted metal. The federal building was 20 minutes away by car, but I didn't have a car. I called an Uber, trying to look casual, while standing on a street corner with evidence of a 30-year conspiracy in my hands. The ride felt like hours. Every police car we passed made me flinch. Every pedestrian could be one of Richard's people. By the time we reached downtown, I was a nervous wreck. U.S. Attorney Sarah Chen was exactly what I'd expected. Sharp, professional, and skeptical. Her office was on the 15th floor, with a view of Lake Michigan that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. "Code Phoenix," I said when her assistant tried to turn me away. Within minutes, I was sitting across from Chen, explaining everything. She listened without interruption, occasionally taking notes. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Detective Rodriguez contacted me an hour ago," she finally said. "She's in the hospital with a gunshot wound, but she's alive?" She managed to arrest Detective Mills before backup arrived. Relief flooded through me. "So what happens now? Now we move fast?" Mills is talking, trying to cut a deal. "He's already given us enough to arrest Richard and 12 other people, including 3 federal agents and a judge. But we need your testimony to make the charges stick." "What about my safety?" "Witness protection until the trial. After that, you'll be free to live your life however you want." I thought about my father's house, about the year I was supposed to spend there according to his will. What about my inheritance? The legitimate parts will be held in trust until the trial is over. The illegal assets will be seized, but that's not your problem anymore. That evening, I was in a safe house in Wisconsin, watching the news coverage of the arrests. Richard Carver was led away in handcuffs, his face a mask of fury. Vincent Torino and 7 members of his organization were also arrested. The reporter mentioned that this was the result of a years-long investigation into corruption and organized crime. But the story that interested me most was buried in the back of the newscast. A small item about Detective Angela Rodriguez being commended for her bravery in breaking up a corruption ring. She'd been promoted to sergeant and was expected to make a full recovery. 3 months later, was back in Chicago for the trial. Richard had refused to take a plea deal, insisting he was innocent. But the evidence was overwhelming. The recorded conversations, the financial records, the DNA evidence from my mother's car. It painted a picture of a man who'd killed for money and power. The most damning testimony came from Vincent Torino himself, who'd decided to cooperate in exchange for a reduced sentence. He described in detail how Richard had approached him about eliminating a problem, my mother, how they'd made it look like an accident, how they'd continued to use the company for money laundering for over 3 decades. When it was my turn to testify, I looked Richard in the eye for the first time since our meeting at Starbucks. He looked older, defeated. The powerful businessman was gone, replaced by a bitter old man who'd lost everything. I told the jury about my childhood, about my father's apparent rejection, about discovering the truth after his death, I explained. How my mother had died not in an accident, because she'd threatened to expose Richard's crimes. The verdict was unanimous. Guilty on all charges. Richard Carver was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Vincent Torino received 25 years. The corrupt officials who'd protected them received sentences ranging from 10 to 15 years. After the trial, visited my father's grave for the first time since the funeral. The headstone was simple: Theodore James Blackwood, beloved father and husband. But now I understood what those words really meant. I placed a letter on his grave, thanking him for everything he'd done to protect me and seek justice for my mother. I told him I understood now why he'd pushed me away, why he'd called me useless. It hadn't been cruelty, it had been love. The inheritance was mine now, legitimately. $12 million, the house, and a company that could finally operate, without the shadow of corruption. But more than that, I had the truth. I knew who my parents really were, and I knew that my father had loved me enough to sacrifice our relationship to keep me safe. I kept the house, but sold the company. I used part of the money to establish the Elizabeth Blackwood Foundation, focused on helping victims of organized crime. The rest I invested, living quietly but comfortably. Detective Rodriguez, now Sergeant Rodriguez, became a friend. She'd been right about finishing what my father started. Justice had finally been served. 32 years late, but not too late. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd refused the inheritance. if I'd walked away from that lawyer's office and never looked back. But I know now that wasn't really an option. My father had been preparing me for this moment my entire life, even if neither of us realized it at the time. The man who'd called me useless had actually been teaching me the most important lesson of all. Sometimes the greatest act of love is sacrifice. Sometimes protecting someone means pushing them away. Sometimes the truth is worth waiting 32 years to discover. Richard Carver died in prison 2 years later. I didn't attend his funeral, but I did visit my mother's grave that day. I told her that justice had finally been served, that the man who'd killed her had paid for his crimes. And I promised her that I would use the second chance at life and my father had given me to do something meaningful. The house on Maple Ridge is quiet now, but it's no longer haunted by the ghosts of misunderstanding and rejection. It's a place where I can finally remember my father not as the man who called me useless, as the man who loved me enough to appear to hate me. Sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money or property. Sometimes it's the truth and the knowledge that you were loved more than you ever knew. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.